You know his voice, but now you're going to get to learn his story. Of course, MPB's former radio reporter, Delane Childrey, thank you for coming in today. Of course, you're an award-winning journalist, but you have got an amazing story to tell, and thank you for coming in today to tell it to us.
Marshall, thank you for having me here. You know, it's just like I'm back at home. You know, MPB is where I cut my teeth on reporting, and just to be back in the studio here is just an amazing feeling.
Well, it is good to have you back home, but home was originally in Birmingham, Alabama. Take us back to the very beginning of your life, because it's been an incredible life.
Born and raised in Birmingham for the most part. I was born in 1962, the day before Halloween. I started my book actually by saying that. And I kind of look at it as, you know, the day before Halloween, you know, how appropriate. You know, if I was one of those people that believed in omens, I would say it was an omen for the way that my life would turn out. But I was raised to a single mother. She was 16 years old when she had me. We lived with her parents, my grandfather and grandmother. I remember a lot of times in the kitchen with my grandmom. I remember a lot of times in the garden with my granddad. You know, grew up in a loving household. My aunts and uncles also lived with us. Well, actually, my uncle had gone off to the service by the time I was born. But I had two aunts that I absolutely adored. And I kind of look at it like my aunts were the ones that really raised me, because my mom was only 16 years old. She was still in school. And I had one aunt in particular that used to read to me all the time. And I remember her taking me out shopping with her. That was my Aunt Vaughn. She was one of my favorites. Not to say that Aunt Jean is not a favorite, but Vaughn at that time was one of my favorites. And I remember her taking me shopping with her one day. And she said, if you be good, I'll buy you something when we get ready to come home. And I'm like, okay. And I remember, you know, I'm gonna be on my best behavior that day. And we're in the store. We had been in 6 or 7 stores by that time. And there was this rack of scarves that was just waiting on me to come by there and just give them a turn, you know? And I went and I turned that rack of scarves, and they just went flying all over the place. And when they started settling down, my aunt was like grabbing me by the shoulders and saying, come on, let's go. So that's the kind of relationship that I had in the house. And then Aunt Jean, the one I mentioned, she's the one that used to take me to all of my doctor's appointments. She's the one that used to dress me up in little suits and all that. She loved it. You know, at that time I was a little curly-haired kid, and she used to take me to my. People actually thought that she was my mom because we spent so much time together. I remember at 2 years old, and it was right after my grandmother had passed. 2 years old, Jean had a son, and his name was Terry, and. He and I became best friends, you know. I was Aunt Jean's baby for those 2 years. And then when she had Terry, Terry became my little baby, you know. And I used to take care of him. I used to, you know, sing to him and all of this kind of stuff. And one day, while Aunt Jean was out shopping, my grandfather was at home taking care of us. And I can remember that Terry and I used to love to watch my granddad playing this, well, not playing, but burn this potbelly stove, you know, to keep the house warm. And he used to put that stick in there and turn it, and we could see the ashes and the fire, the embers, you know, change colors and all that. We used to love to see that. One day while he was keeping us, he got winded, and he went into the room next to the living room and sat in his chair. And I remember him singing Amazing Grace. You know, it was just Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound, you know, that old hymn. And while he was asleep, and he was actually asleep, he was, you could hear the snoring. Terry and I decided that we wanted to go and see more of that fire.
You were 4 and 3 at the time.
I was 4.
Yeah.
He was 2.
2.
Yeah,
Okay.
I was 4 and he was
Yeah.
2. And so we had seen the Tarzan movies on TV where they're running through the jungle with these little tiki lanterns, these little torches, and we loved that and we wanted that. And we got sticks and clothes hangers and we tied little rags to them and we started playing in the fire and blah, blah, blah.
Oh, wow. So you're playing literally with fire.
Yeah, we're playing with fire. We're playing in the potbelly stove with these little torches that we had made from sticks and clothes hangers. And I remember pulling the torch out of the stove so that we can get a closer look at it. And we're just running through the house, you know, just playing, having fun. And I can remember when the fire fell to the floor, the tattered rug, and the rug caught on fire. And he and I tried to put it out with little glasses of water. You know, we're 2 and 4 years old, you know, and we're trying to put it out with little glasses of water. And the next thing you know, the curtains are on the fire, and then the bedspread is on fire, and everything is on fire. And I can remember Terry wanting to go into the room where the fire was actually raging at this point to hide under the bed, thinking if he could get under the bed, he would be okay.
He was afraid he was going to get in trouble.
He was afraid he was going to get in trouble, but he
Yeah.
was also thinking that he could hide under there from
the
the
fire.
fire. Yeah. And so in the meantime, you know, I can remember vividly trying to pull him back. Terry, no, Terry, no, Terry, no. And I could still feel even as we talk about it now, I can still feel the sweat, you know, and
the
how
heat?
the heat, and even now I can kind of see the smoke and see the scene. But I remember him slipping from my hands, running under the bed, and I remember calling my granddad. But at that point, I was in such a state of shock. I can remember being in a corner in the living room just looking at him, and while his body is burning, I'm stood frozen there in this state of shock. Luckily for me, a guy had just been passing by checking power meters and happened to see the smoke billowing from the rooftop, and he burst through the door and he was able to save me, but he couldn't save my cousin Terry. In the meantime, my granddad was trying to get to us too, but the smoke and the fire kept him from getting to us, so he ended up actually bursting out the window. He had to break out the second-story window and jump. He ended up with his teeth knocked out. He broke, you know, some cuts and bruises and all that, but thankfully he survived. So that's where I think my trauma actually began, because it went unaddressed.
In your book, Peeling Back the Layers, you talk about it very vividly. And let me ask you about that experience, because when you sat down to write the book, this was really a memory that you had not really touched on for years. And you have to sit down and you have to relive this. That had to be incredibly traumatic.
I remember that was one of the first, that is the first chapter in the book.
Yeah.
And I sat down to write it, and parts of it were easy to write. But after I sat there and read what I had written, I understood how intense that really was.
Your mom was young, 16 years old when she had you. She didn't marry your dad, but she did get married.
Mm-hmm.
And so suddenly you had a dad in your life.
Yeah.
And that was the next trauma that you were going to experience.
My dad and I were at home alone watching sports or a Western or something. I don't remember. But I can remember him asking me to come and sit on the sofa with him. And I did. And I remember him reaching out for me. And he asked me to touch him inappropriately.
Right.
And I did. And it was odd to me, because that had never happened before.
Right.
And somewhere in my mind, I guess I thought it to be a touch of endearment, you know. And I remember the day, you know, I was playing with my little toy cars on the floor, you know, and all of a sudden he was like, come here. And I did. And for the longest, I thought that I had done something wrong, you know. And it wasn't just him.
Right.
It was also his brother.
Yeah.
And honestly, I don't know if his brother was a grown man or just a teenager, but he looked like a grown man,
Right.
you know.
When you're little, too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And but he used to carry me to the basement of their parents' house and basically do the same thing. And it was only heavy petting
Yeah.
with both instances. And I thought I was the only one that was happening to. It turns out that my cousin and I, we were about the same age. We used to play together. This was like a step cousin, because I later found out that was not my real
Right.
father. So it was not my real cousin, but at the time I thought that was my real
Right.
cousin. And the same thing, we ended up in the basement where our uncle used to take me to masturbate him, if I can say that. And my little cousin and I, we were the same age, we started playing with each other. And so writing this book and thinking about those things, I started thinking, did the same thing happen to him that happened to me? Because that's a conversation that we never discussed.
Right.
We never discussed it. So
Your childhood and your influences, you did have some good times. And some great times.
Some
And
awesome
one of
times.
those moments, and this is a moment I think I can really appreciate, and I was reading it, when I was reading the book, I was thinking, yeah, I was just the same way. You fell in love watching the evening news. You'd see Walter Cronkite, and you said, this is what I want to be when I grow up. Now, you didn't take a straight path to get there, but when you were a little bit older, you had a chance to go to Alabama Public Radio and go in their studio and actually get to experience live broadcasting.
Oh man, what a feeling. You know, even just sitting here talking about that now, you know, how amazing. You know, I grew up basically a kid in the hood, you know, but to have a school teacher to recognize some talent in us, because all of this came about because there was a program through the Alabama Department of Ed where they were looking for students to write a script about situations that were going on in their communities, things that children wanted to see fixed.
And of course, you were talking about?
We were talking about child abuse.
Right.
You know, and at that time, I didn't even equate everything that I had been through with child abuse.
Right.
You know, it's ironic that you bring that up
Yeah.
because it really didn't occur to me until I was an adult. You know,
Mm-hmm.
wow, I was talking about this even then. But we had the opportunity to go to Alabama Public Television, and it was housed at that time in Phillips High School. And I can remember going there. Man, it was just an exciting time, being in the studio for the very first time. We actually got to write the script. We actually got to act out the parts, and just being on a set similar to this. I remember the bright lights. I remember the microphones and the stands in front of us with us reading our little scripts from it. It was just an amazing time.
You obviously had some devils in your life, but you had a lot of angels too. You had people that encouraged you. Talk about some of the early influences in your life.
You know, there were so many influences in my life. My mom was a big influence in me, you know. Of course, you know, in the book, I hope I didn't portray my mom in a negative light. That's been a concern of mine.
I will tell you this, that when she found out that you were gay, her comment to your boyfriend at the time, which we cannot say on the air, but made me like her, because she said, you know what, basically, I'm going to paraphrase, don't mess with my boy. That was pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which meant she didn't even question your life. She said, this is my son, I'm going to take care of him.
Yeah.
And you took care of her.
Yeah. And my mom, you know, I'm so thankful that I have at least some of the genes from my mom, because my mom was a real survivor.
She's a tough lady.
Tough lady, you know, in so many ways. My mom, and we're going a little bit ahead, but my mom survived lung cancer, brain tumor, several strokes, and she was dancing until she couldn't dance anymore. So, you know, she was that type of woman. And just to know that I have some of those genes in me.
Well, you obviously do, because you lost somebody that was very dear to you. You lost him to HIV and to AIDS. At the time, though, you also had HIV. And you describing at the time going to the health department to find out. And this was back when, you know, when people didn't want to admit that they had HIV. So you were debating whether or not to park miles away and walk, or to go into the parking garage and go straight in. But you found out that you had HIV, and that changed your life, didn't it?
HIV did change my life. But what really changed my life was when I was told I had AIDS.
That's right. And that was like 10 years after you.
That was 10 years later, yeah. And that is what really changed my life. HIV did change my life.
Right.
Seeing people around me die did.
You've lost over 100 friends?
Oh, I've lost hundreds of friends. I've lost so many friends that I stopped counting.
Yeah.
You know, and yeah, going back to that time, you know, trying to go to, and the reason I even tested is because I had a female cousin, and we were very close, that tested positive for AIDS, not HIV, AIDS.
And she died fairly quickly.
She died very quickly.
Very quickly,
Yeah, because they had done so many tests on her, looking for this, looking for that, never could find anything. And finally, one of the doctors there at Emory University in Atlanta finally said, let's test her for HIV. And when she tested for she didn't test positive for HIV. She tested positive for AIDS. And after her diagnosis, I was like, I know that Cheryl couldn't have done half of the things that I've done. Yeah. I know that because Cheryl was just my idea of what the perfect woman should be. You know, she was my idea of this beautiful woman living a beautiful life, you know, she and her husband. But when she tested positive for HIV, I was like, man, I know I've got to go and get tested. But going to get tested was a big deal.
Right.
I was so afraid because of the stigma that somebody would see me going in there to be tested. I was just really afraid of that.
You had all the traumas of your childhood. You had gone through some failed relationships. You got, unfortunately, addicted to crack cocaine. There was a point where you hit rock bottom, when you wanted basically to die by crack, death by crack. What helped you turn your life around? You know,
it got to the point where I was doing this crack cocaine every day. It got to the point where I was hanging out late at night in places that I would never hang out at night. You know, I can remember the last night that I got high on crack cocaine, and I call it a free high. That's what they call it, you know, a free high. That's when somebody else is paying your way to get high all night. And the interesting thing is that I was usually the one that was paying, you know, for the crack cocaine. You know, I always believe in paying my own way. So
good job at the bank, hey, no problem.
Pay your own way. But this particular night, this guy and I had been getting high all night. And we finally ran out of crack. And so we were going to go and find some more. And it's like 2 o'clock in the morning. And we're calling up all the people that we know, and nobody has anything. And so we get in the car, and we just start riding around Birmingham, you know, all the places that we knew that, you know, sold crack cocaine.
Mm-hmm.
And we finally stumbled up on these projects in Birmingham. Now, I didn't know them, but the guy that I was with said he knew them. I don't know if he really did or not. And we drove up into these apartments, these projects, and this group of guys come out. And they're like, well, what do you want, man? And my buddy said, well, we're here to see Skip. And he said, well, Skip is not here. What can I get for you? And he said, well, we want to get, I think it was an 8-ball. He said, well, I can do that. And so my friend and I, we were both kind of uncomfortable with this situation. You know, this is one of the most notorious housing projects in Birmingham. People have been found dead there, you know.
And you end up having to stand behind a dumpster while waiting for them to go get the, you're lucky you didn't end up in a body bag.
You know, that night, they said, we can make the deal.
Yeah.
But part of that deal is that your friend has to get out the car because we don't want it to look like a drug deal in place, okay?
Right.
So we need him to get out the car.
So if you were a cat, you pretty much had used up 8 of your lives at that point.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, easily.
Oh, yeah.
And then too, the AIDS came along, your T cell count was a 3,
Oh, yeah.
which means you were in the death zone.
Oh, yeah.
And then
Well within the death
when
zone.
you pulled through that, you looked the doctor in the eye and said, I'm going back to school, age 40. You went to Jefferson State Community College.
Yeah.
And then next thing you know, you're winning Edward R. Murrow Awards. It's amazing.
It is an amazing story, you know, and even as a journalist, you know, writing this book, looking at this story, you know, in its totality,
Yeah.
it's just amazing to me.
It truly is. And when you were here in Mississippi covering issues in the Delta, covering issues all around the state, do you feel like that your life experience changed you as a journalist?
I think that my life experiences helped me as a journalist.
Yes.
You know, in the newsroom, I was always the one that they would say, oh, LaWayne can get anybody to talk. LaWayne can get any story, you know. It was not, and I've done a lot of stories about dropouts and stories of that nature. And it's been nothing for me to be able to approach people standing out on the streets. You know, I can still remember some of those stories, you know, up in the Delta. I didn't know these people, but I had no fear because
Right.
I had been there. And now people know my secret, but that's the way that I was able to approach people and get them to open up and talk.
You realize, just like you, that everybody had an amazing story to tell.
You know, and it's interesting that you said that, because in the foreword of the book, Janice, who was one of my advisors at Jeff State, she opened the foreword by saying, everyone has a story to tell and a lesson to teach. It's a story of the human condition, you know, and people, when they read it, they glean so many different things from it. When I first started writing the book, one of my colleagues in the news business, she and I had become very good friends, and we would talk at least once a week. And I had written the introduction to the book. I had written maybe the first 4 or 5 chapters, and I gave her the manuscript to read because, you know, that's just what you do. You know, you want to get input. You want to know how people are thinking about what you're writing. And she and I didn't talk for over a month, and we used to talk at least once a week. And I'm like, oh my God, she can't handle the truth. And I called her up after that month. She didn't answer the phone. She called me right back within 2 minutes. And when I answered the phone, I could hear her in tears. And I'm like, oh my God, she really can't handle the truth. But she told me, LaWayne, I just want to thank you for telling my cousin's story. She said, he didn't die from AIDS. He didn't die from addiction, although he had those things going on. He died from an abusive relationship. She said, but LaWayne, I know if he had had someone like you to just talk with, just to share stories with, he would be alive today. And I get so many people, you know, whenever I give this talk, this speech, whenever I tell my story, so many people come up to me afterwards and say, thank you for telling my story. Thank you for telling my son's story. Thank you for giving my family hope. And that's what this story is all about.
LaWayne, thank you for coming in today and telling your story. You have lived an amazing life and you're doing a great job paying it forward. Thank you for coming in today on Conversations.
Marshall, thank you so much for having me. Thank you.